Right now, US Special Forces are conducting a Black Ops sabotage campaign deep behind Russia's lines. A new report from The Telegraph just revealed that since June 2025, CIA operatives are now following a much more aggressive strategy than the public previously knew about, coordinating operations deep inside Russia. Russian agents have been waging a hybrid war against Europe for the past few years, and now it appears the West is striking back. Today, I'm going to show you what targets are already being hit and what happens when one of these operations goes wrong. We're just now learning that when the Russian military launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, in response, the CIA partnered with their NATO allies to activate sleeper cells that were already inside Russia. These agents began collecting intelligence on the war effort from behind the lines. According to authors Jack Murphy and Tim Weiner's reporting, the double agents had stashed explosives and weapons inside Russia more than a decade earlier after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since the 1990s, early 2000s, the CIA's Moscow station had built up an elaborate stay-behind network of spies that we previously didn't know about. From Tim Weiner's great book, The Mission, the CIA's elite team of paramilitary officers, Brown Branch, trained these operatives at bases inside Germany and Poland before sending them into Russia. They were given the job of evading Russia's FSB Internal Security Service. These agents lived seemingly normal lives among the Russian populace thanks to elaborate cover stories and forged documents. We've long known about Russian sleeper agents inside the United States and inside Europe. The KGB has famously flipped some officers at the top level of the US intelligence community, and those have been given prison sentences for it. Oftentimes, the only reason we know about these Russian spies are because of the high-profile prisoner swaps. But what fascinates me about this is how we're learning about Western sleeper agents inside Russia for the first time. Within weeks of the invasion, mysterious explosions started happening inside Russia. There were fires and industrial quote-unquote accidents. Accidents according to local media, but these suspicious sabotage actions always plagued the Russian side and made their supply shortages even worse, curiously. Key rail bridges, fuel depots, and power plants all suspiciously got blown up early in the war. Since then, it's only doubled down. I've scoured Russian sources, Russian language media, from their state media to their Millblogger accounts on Telegram for recent reports. These here, and here, these are different sabotage incidents that I found from 2025 to today. Russia has an entire roving patrol across the country that now searches for sabotage teams. And we know what can happen when these high-risk missions go awry. According to sources who spoke to Jack Murphy of the High Side, one time 2 separate sleeper cells compromised each other while casing the same target. They accidentally gave away each other's position, and a fierce firefight broke out with Russian authorities. It resulted in the death of one agent and the capture of another. And there were a few occasions where roads and railways were cut, and that blocked a separate team trying to get to their target. The CIA was forced to create a deconfliction process to keep track of all these different teams and their targets inside Russia to avoid further incidents like this. But the best intelligence comes from, quote, the elite level teams that we have the best relationships with are almost always given air surveillance support for major sabotage ops. Drones we don't even know about yet are loitering all over the Ukrainian and Russian airspace, end quote. What's interesting is how Western media does the same thing and reports that highlight links to Russia's GRU and SVR in attacks across Europe. The reason we're seeing this now is because since at least 2014, there have been increasing incidents of Russian GRU agents conducting a covert campaign against the US and Europe. Moscow spies have blown up rail lines in Poland, burned down warehouses with aid to Ukraine, poisoned dissidents in the open, tried to assassinate heads of defense companies, and attempted to blow up packages on a flight. That's just a few of the missions that Russia's covertly been responsible for. What we're seeing here from the outside looking in, I think, is a ramping up of this hybrid war. But before we get into that, I use this episode's sponsor, Ground News, to research this breaking story because it's the best tool to stay objective with my reporting. I use their website to find and analyze reports of Russian covert action across Europe. Currently, Russia's strategy is an attempt to drain Europe's investigative resources with its sabotage campaign. Ground News has become my favorite app on my phone because I'll scroll through reports and get wind of stories like this one before major outlets get wind of it. These attacks were directly linked to Yevgeny Ivanov and the Wagner Group. Similar to tactics used by Western intelligence agencies, they outsource sabotage to local criminal groups already in the country. Ground News now allows me to view how factual each of these stories are. One of my favorite tools is how I have the ability to follow where the money comes from and see who funds each source and where their bias is. This way, we're able to see how both intelligence agencies are ramping up attacks on one another. Ground News is offering you guys 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use. Just click my link in the description or go to ground.news/Cappy or scan the QR code up there to bring your price down to just $5 a month. Similar to the tactics we've seen of Russian sabotage attacks throughout Europe, the clandestine operation in Russia was allegedly run in partnership with NATO's allies, who actually had their operatives in country in Russia to provide a crucial layer of plausible deniability for the US. In response to the wave of suspicious explosions and accidents behind Russian lines, CIA Director of Public Affairs Tammy Thorpe said, quote, "The allegations that CIA is somehow supporting saboteur networks in Russia is categorically false," end quote. However, Title 50 of US Code states the CIA can legally lie to the American public or whoever else to preserve operational integrity. So long as they keep congressional leaders properly briefed, it's all above board by US standards. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and then allegedly interfered in the 2016 US election, that's when the NSA started working with the relatively new US Cyber Command on a fail-safe solution. They began planting cyber weapons in Russia's critical infrastructure. These can then be activated at a later date to shut down critical services from power to water, similar to the type of cyber weapons we saw used against Iran and Venezuela most recently. You might think the Russian government would be highlighting these missions, but counterintuitively, Moscow's actually actively tried to hide any evidence that Western agents are running amok in their backlines. Without many arrests to show progress, such a revelation would only weaken morale. When 20 people were killed when a Russian Aerospace Defense Forces Institute building burned to the ground in April 2022, the TASS state-run media company blamed the fire on old faulty wiring. If they suspected foul play, they didn't mention any of it to the public. The intelligence that these undercover officers collected can be more important than the bombs. John Ratcliffe, the new CIA director, gave his philosophy of gray operations, saying he believed that warrantless collection was an indispensable national security tool, and said that broader collection under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act accounted for more than half of the actionable intelligence. The US intelligence community correctly predicted that the Russian invasion would happen almost to the day, and they provided detailed war plans to Ukraine and the rest of Europe leading up to the invasion, while most around the world were skeptical and unwilling to accept that a major war was about to kick off. It's also why reports indicate that the Stay Behind network was able to activate even days prior to the invasion because they knew what was about to happen. Exactly how the United States got such detailed intelligence from right under the noses of Russia's security apparatus is, of course, a closely guarded secret, but it reveals the level to which they've penetrated the Russian government. Former CIA paramilitary officer Mick Mulroy said, "I do not know who is behind these attacks, but their value is substantial and serves multiple purposes. Russia has had a significant problem keeping up with its logistical supply lines. These attacks further complicate its efforts to supply its forces," end quote. Since then, covert action by America and Russia against one another has only escalated. Since then, NATO generals have openly started talking about preemptive strikes against Russia in retaliation, and it appears the first step is the US intelligence community was authorized to hit back. And the first indication of this came in 2024, when Ukraine's long-range drone strikes against Russian oil refineries were starting to run into a significant problem. A majority of the Ukrainian munitions were being intercepted, shot down, or zapped by Russian electronic warfare before they even got to their targets. And when Kiev did manage to hit the oil refineries, they weren't sure the extent of the damage they did, which makes follow-up attacks more difficult to plan. Worse yet, they weren't sure where to even aim to deal the most damage. This meant prior to this summer, Russia was able to easily repair the refineries after each wave of attack within just a matter of days. Then, starting in summer 2025, CIA officers were surprisingly authorized to help tip the scales. And the way they did it was they spent months poring over and analyzing schematics of Russian refineries. They looked at every blueprint looking for something specific, trying to find a vulnerable, difficult to replace part. And that's when an expert analyst with a touch of the oil refinery tism found a precision machine coupler that is incredibly difficult to replace, because sanctions on that part make it extremely hard for the Russian companies to come by. The piece of hardware is so sensitive that it's described as an oil refinery's quote-unquote Achilles heel. The Death Star vent shaft, if you will. Open source public-facing reports that you or I can access won't describe it in any more detail than that. Yes, most Jack Ryan's spy work is just reading through hundreds of pages of oil refinery parts and compliance sheets before you get to actually blow anything up. According to officials who spoke to the Telegraph, CIA officers partnered with and helped guide Ukrainian drone operators on how to fly their strike package in a way that would avoid Russian air defense systems. Then, American intelligence provided key-specific live battle damage reports. But the pressure wasn't enough. So beginning in October 2025, the US military began providing Ukraine with new intelligence, but this time for missile strikes to hit those refineries deep inside Russia. Almost immediately after this, we started seeing reports of precision UK-provided Storm Shadow missiles and other long-range munitions hitting Russian oil refineries in vulnerable locations. Repairs were quickly becoming more difficult to sustain. This is the unsexy side of modern warfare. It's spreadsheets generated from satellites that are more lethal than sending artillery sometimes. But every tit has its tat, because at the same time, we started observing the first evidence that the Chinese Communist Party is providing the same type of satellite targeting data, but to Russian units, to help them hit Ukrainian troops and buildings. This is when American intelligence went into overdrive. Ukrainian long-range missile strikes against those Russian oil refineries became a lot more surgical and destructive virtually overnight. By late October, analysts estimated that the Ukrainians had destroyed over 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity. This is why you started hearing in the news a bunch of reports about how there was suddenly a domestic fuel crisis inside Russia. It's still going on today, where you see Russians queuing up in long lines for gas. These combined actions of better weapons and better American intelligence put Russian oil refineries out of action for months instead of just days. But no single operation is a silver bullet that will end the war. This is a high-pressure campaign that the US, Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and China appear to be playing against each other. What we know from US officials is that the US intelligence community has had intelligence drones over Ukraine, helping provide targeting data on Russian infantry position for years. But those attacks near the front line weren't having the kind of operational impact that was needed. And according to new, widely available reports from Bloomberg and Reuters, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It gets much deeper than that, because starting in late November 2025, the White House started authorizing the CIA to share targeting information on Russia's sanctioned shadow fleet of oil tankers for the first time ever. This is the strategic logistics network that keeps Russia's war funding afloat. The head of the American intelligence agency, John Ratcliffe, said, quote, "We will collect intelligence, especially human intelligence, in every corner of the globe, no matter how dark or difficult," end quote. Ukraine was given precise locations and tracking intelligence on the fleet, a level of detail that only American Space Command is able to provide. What happened next is Ukrainian Sea Baby attack munitions were launched from small ships at sea. The quasi-autonomous torpedoes then hunted Russian oil tankers outside the Black Sea for the first time ever. In fact, 5 Shadow Fleet tankers have already been hit since 2025, and the US on top of that captured another 5 tankers, with Europe capturing 3 more. The crazy thing is, 1 Shadow Fleet tanker was even as far off as the West African coast, a level of power projection that we have never seen before. Why does all of this matter? For all the money that crosses over the seas every year, shipping companies are skittish beasts. The sudden threat has already resulted in causing one major shipping company in Turkey to cut their losses and stop working with Moscow altogether. This has an impact on the Kremlin's war funding. As a major oil and natural gas exporter, the reduction in refining capacity means dramatically reduced funding for the Russian government and military, as much as $24 billion a year in lost profits, according to US intelligence reports. But so far, these efforts have failed to cause the major crack, the operational destruction that they're looking for. What does that mean comes next? There is now a notable change in tone. Sharing all this new information with Ukraine represents a major shift in US strategy that we're seeing. Because before mid-2025, the US government actually discouraged Ukraine from damaging Russia's oil infrastructure, so it wouldn't disrupt the world's oil markets too much. Insiders told The Telegraph that the US government was growing frustrated at Putin's repeated bait and switch tactics during ceasefire negotiations throughout the past year. They got the vibe that Putin was uninterested in ending the war. And according to their thinking, if enough damage is able to be inflicted on Russia's oil industry, it would force the Russian side to come to the table in good faith. Whether that was the actual reasoning or not, coordinated Ukrainian missile strikes is just the tip of the iceberg. The major shift has a name attached to it. John Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe is the new head of the CIA, arguably the most ruthless and top intelligence agency in the world. Surprisingly, he's not your traditional CIA director because he's a former federal prosecutor instead of a career case officer. He came into the job with a very clear belief about how intelligence works and who it's for. And in his words, intelligence is about more than just warning policymakers after the fact. He's gone on record saying it should be used to shape the battlefield before the first shot is fired. This shift in philosophy explains the new approach that we're seeing. In public remarks during congressional testimony, he's gone on record saying, quote, "Russia is the single greatest threat to U.S. national security short of nuclear war." Ratcliffe has argued that publicly that risk avoidance became a liability after 2016, and this puts us into the headspace and the philosophy of the new CIA operations. Because under Ratcliffe, the intelligence community's posture changed to be more assertive around the world. During testimony to the Senate on his confirmation hearing, he laid out a vision of being more aggressive with covert actions, as opposed to previous administrations' focus on delivering analysis. He said they will be, quote, "going places no one else can go and doing things no one else can do," end quote. This shows the US government has been taking a much more active hard power role in trying to stop Russia. Taken together, these operations show that the United States has moved from deterrence to active disruption, quietly striking the systems that keep Russia's war machine alive. But once great powers start sabotaging each other's economies, history shows it rarely stays covert for long. If you like this episode, check out this one here about why the new militarized Iron Curtain dividing the West and Russia is so dangerous. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy, ending transmission.